You criminals don't belong in this neighborhood. Take your ghetto trash and get out before I call the police on all of you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street when Karen Henderson stormed across her manicured lawn, jabbed her finger directly at David Johnson's chest, and screamed for the entire neighborhood to hear. She then made an exaggerated shooing motion, waving her arms like she was driving away wild animals, her face twisted with disgust and hatred. Behind her, children playing freeze mid-laugh. Families gathering for a peaceful barbecue suddenly feel the weight of generations of prejudice crashing down on what should have been a perfect Saturday afternoon. What Karen didn't know was that her venomous words had just triggered a sequence of events that would expose the most dangerous assumptions we make about power, authority, and who really belongs where. Have you ever watched someone's hatred backfire so completely that it destroyed everything they thought they knew about the world? This is that story. To understand what happened next, you need to know who David Johnson really was. At 42, he moved through the world with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from 20 years of handling life-and-death situations. When he walked into a room, he automatically positioned himself where he could see all the exits. When his phone buzzed with encrypted messages marked urgent, classified, he would glance at them briefly, then set the device aside with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to national security briefings. His wife, Sarah, a federal prosecutor, had learned not to ask too many questions about David's work. She knew he traveled frequently to Washington, that their home security system was more sophisticated than most government buildings, and that the quiet men in suits who occasionally appeared at neighborhood events weren't just friends from work. Their twin daughters, Maya and Zoe, were 8-year-old honor students who had no idea their father's job was anything more exciting than boring office work. They knew Daddy sometimes had to take important phone calls at strange hours and that their house had better Wi-Fi than anyone else on the block, but that was normal to them. The Johnson family had moved to Oakwood Heights 6 months ago, becoming the first black family on Maple Street. It was an exclusive suburb 30 minutes outside Chicago, where houses started at $3 million and political connections mattered more than property taxes. For the Johnsons, it represented safety, excellent schools, and the kind of quiet suburban life that David's dangerous career made precious. But not everyone welcomed their arrival. Karen Henderson lived directly across the street in a colonial mansion that had belonged to her family for 3 generations. At 55, she had transformed herself into the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian after her divorce left her bitter, isolated, and desperately clinging to the one thing she still controlled: her sense of social superiority. More importantly, Karen was married to City Councilman Richard Henderson, a connection she wielded like a weapon against anyone who threatened her vision of how the neighborhood should look. She had called the city about zoning violations 23 times in the past 6 months. Every single complaint targeted families of color. She had filed 8 formal HOA violations, each one dismissed as frivolous, but the message was clear. Certain people weren't welcome. What made Karen truly dangerous wasn't just her racism. It was her absolute certainty that her political connections made her untouchable. She had the mayor's personal cell phone number. She hosted fundraisers for the police chief. When she made threats, she believed she had the power to follow through on them. The annual neighborhood barbecue had been a Maple Street tradition for 15 years. This year, the Johnsons had volunteered to host, hoping to build bridges with their new community. They had obtained every permit, followed every regulation, and invited everyone on the block. The guest list was more diverse than Maple Street had ever seen. Sarah's colleagues from the federal prosecutor's office mingled with David's friends, though most neighbors assumed they were just government employees, not noticing the way they positioned themselves around the property's perimeter, or how they spoke quietly into nearly invisible earpieces. Mrs. Lane, an elderly neighbor, had brought homemade dumplings and spent an hour teaching Maya and Zoe how to fold them properly. The Rodriguez family contributed tamales and stories about their own immigration journey. Even some of Karen's traditional allies had shown up, won over by Sarah's invitation and genuine warmth. but Karen watched from her window with growing fury. She made phone calls to important people in City Hall. She researched property records, looking for violations. She convinced herself that the Johnsons were somehow criminals who had deceived everyone about their true nature. At 2:15 p.m., Karen's paranoia crystallized into action. She grabbed a folder full of printed city ordinances, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to use every ounce of political leverage she possessed to destroy the Johnson family's reputation. As she marched across the street, she had no idea that David Johnson had just received an encrypted message that would have terrified her. Deputy Director, Security Briefing Monday, 0800, Congressional Testimony Prep required. The most powerful woman on Maple Street was about to discover just how powerless she really was. At exactly 2:30 p.m., Karen Henderson crossed the invisible line between neighbor and enemy. She stormed across Maple Street carrying a thick folder of city ordinances, her face flushed with righteous anger and political certainty. Behind her, City Councilman Richard Henderson watched from their front window with growing dread, knowing his wife's capacity for destruction when her prejudices took control. "Excuse me," she shouted, waving the papers above her head as she approached the peaceful gathering. "This illegal assembly ends now. I'm shutting this down under municipal authority." Sarah Johnson looked up from the grill where she was flipping burgers for the children, her federal prosecutor instincts immediately recognizing the tone of someone looking for a fight. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson. Is there a problem? We have all the proper permits and followed every city regulation." Karen's laugh was sharp and cruel. The sound of someone who believed political connections made her untouchable. "Permits? Do you have any idea who my husband is? Richard Henderson sits on the city council. He personally oversees the permit department. And I'm telling you right now that your little ghetto gathering is violating at least 12 municipal codes." She began reading from her folder with theatrical precision. Noise ordinance violations, improper outdoor cooking permits, parking violations, public nuisance statutes, failure to notify neighbors of large gatherings. I've documented everything. The conversations around the backyard began to quiet. Children, sensing adult tension with the instinct of the young, moved closer to their parents. David Johnson, who had been helping elderly Mr. Peterson fix a wobbly lawn chair, straightened slowly and turned toward the confrontation. Several of his guests, men and women in casual clothes who somehow managed to look like they were still on duty, subtly adjusted their positions around the yard's perimeter. "Ma'am," Sarah said, maintaining her composure with the skill of someone who had faced down defense attorneys in federal court, "we checked every regulation. The noise ordinance allows gatherings until 10 p.m. We have liability insurance. The fire department personally inspected and approved our grilling setup. The city clerk confirmed our permits yesterday." "Don't you dare lecture me about regulations!" Karen's voice rose to a shriek that echoed off the neighboring houses. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. My family built this community. My grandfather was mayor. My father was police chief. We don't need your kind bringing crime and drugs and violence into our safe space." Mrs. Lane, the elderly neighbor who had been teaching Maya and Zoe to fold dumplings, stepped forward with the courage of someone who had survived worse than suburban racism. "Karen, that's enough. The Johnsons are wonderful neighbors. They helped me with my groceries last week when I fell. David fixed my fence gate without being asked." Karen whirled on her with the fury of someone whose worldview was being challenged by inconvenient facts. "Of course you'd defend them, Mrs. Lane. Birds of a feather stick together, but some of us remember when this was a respectable American neighborhood where people knew their place." The Rodriguez family, who had been sharing stories about their immigration journey, gathered their children closer. The Patels, both doctors at Northwestern Memorial, exchanged worried glances. Even some of Karen's traditional allies looked uncomfortable with her escalating rhetoric. That's when David Johnson spoke for the first time. "Mrs. Henderson." His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that made everyone stop talking. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about who belongs here and who has the authority to make that determination. Karen turned to face him, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes. David stood 6 feet tall with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His posture was that of a man trained to assess threats and respond accordingly. When he moved, it was with the fluid awareness that comes from 20 years of handling situations where hesitation could cost lives. His friends from the barbecue, people Karen had dismissed as random government employees, had somehow managed to position themselves strategically around the confrontation without seeming to move at all. But Karen's political arrogance and deep-seated racism overrode any survival instinct she might have possessed. "Oh, I understand perfectly," she snarled, her voice dripping with contempt. "You people think you can move into our neighborhood, bring your suspicious activities, your late-night meetings with all those government cars, and we're supposed to just accept it? I know exactly what you really are." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Several of David's guests exchanged glances that spoke of shared secrets and classified briefings. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her husband's arm, not out of fear for his safety, but because she recognized the look in his eyes that meant someone was about to make a very serious mistake. "And what exactly do you think I am, Mrs. Henderson?" David asked, his tone still conversational, but there was something underneath it now, something that made smart people choose their next words very carefully. "A criminal," Karen declared with absolute certainty. "Some kind of federal operative running illegal surveillance out of your house. I've seen cars with government plates. I've seen high-tech equipment deliveries. I've documented the strange visitors at all hours. I've photographed everything, and I have connections in Washington who can shut down whatever illegal operation you're running." She pulled out a second folder, this one filled with blurry photographs of David's security system installation, delivery trucks bringing encrypted communication equipment, and federal vehicles in his driveway during off-hours briefings. Sarah moved closer to her husband, not out of fear, but out of protective instinct. As a federal prosecutor, she knew David could handle himself in any situation, but she also knew that Karen Henderson was about to cross a line that would trigger consequences she couldn't imagine. "Ma'am," David said, his voice now carrying a warning that anyone with sense would have heeded, "I strongly advise you to be very careful about the accusations you're making. There are federal laws about interfering with government operations." But Karen was past the point of caution. She pulled out her phone with theatrical flourish, her face bright with vindicated rage. "Don't you threaten me! I'm calling the FBI right now! I'm calling Homeland Security! I'm calling every federal agency I can think of until someone comes to arrest you for whatever crimes you're committing in my neighborhood." David exchanged a look with Sarah that was part amusement, part resignation, and part something that might have been pity. "That's actually not necessary, Mrs. Henderson." "Don't you dare tell me what's necessary." Karen was dialing frantically, her fingers shaking with righteous fury. "I have Senator Morrison's personal number. I have connections at the highest levels of government. By tonight, you'll be in federal custody where you belong, and this neighborhood will be safe again." The 911 call that followed was a masterpiece of delusional paranoia that would later become required listening in FBI training courses on threat assessment. Karen painted herself as a heroic citizen exposing a dangerous federal conspiracy, describing David's peaceful barbecue as a cover for espionage activities. She name-dropped politicians with the desperate authority of someone whose entire identity depended on reflected power. She threatened lawsuits, demanded immediate action, and painted a picture of clear and present danger that would have been laughable if it weren't so venomous. What she didn't know was that her call had triggered automatic flags in multiple federal systems. When someone reports suspicious federal activity, certain protocols activate. When someone demands FBI involvement while making specific threats against federal personnel, those protocols escalate with the speed of national security priorities. Instead of the local police cruisers Karen expected, 3 black SUVs with government plates and tinted windows pulled up to the Johnson residence exactly 15 minutes later. Karen practically ran to meet them, her face bright with vindicated triumph and political satisfaction. "Thank God you're here. I'm Karen Henderson, the one who called. I've been documenting the suspicious federal activities coming from that house for months. My husband is City Councilman Richard Henderson. He'll vouch for my credibility." 6 federal agents in dark suits stepped out of the vehicles, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses, their movements precise and professional in the way that speaks of serious training and serious authority. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, approached Karen with a carefully neutral expression. "Ma'am, I'm Agent Martinez, FBI. You reported suspicious federal activity at this address?" "Yes. Finally, someone taking this seriously." "That man," Karen pointed dramatically at David, who was watching the proceedings with calm interest, "has been running some kind of illegal federal operation out of his house. Government vehicles at all hours, high-tech surveillance equipment, secret meetings with people who are obviously federal agents. I demand you arrest him immediately and investigate his criminal activities." Agent Martinez looked past Karen toward the backyard, where David Johnson stood calmly watching the proceedings. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, something that Mrs. Lane noticed from her position near the dumpling station. "Ma'am, we'll need to verify some information before we proceed. Standard protocol for investigations involving federal personnel requires specific clearance procedures." Karen's eyes lit up with savage satisfaction. "I knew it! I knew he was some kind of federal criminal. My husband always said if you want real justice in this country, you should call the FBI directly." As Agent Martinez walked toward David, Karen turned to her neighbors with triumphant vindication, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent backyard. "You see? I was right all along. Sometimes it takes real political connections and the courage to stand up for what's right to expose the truth about people who don't belong in communities like ours." But Mrs. Lane was watching the FBI agent's body language with the sharp eyes of someone who had survived political upheaval in 3 different countries, and something wasn't adding up. The agents weren't approaching David like they were investigating him. They were approaching him like they were protecting him. The truth was about to emerge in the most spectacular way possible, and Karen Henderson had absolutely no idea that her moment of political triumph was about to become the worst mistake of her life. Agent Martinez approached David with the measured stride of someone following federal protocol, her hand resting casually near her weapon in a gesture that seemed routine but carried deadly serious implications. Behind her, the other 5 agents spread out in a formation that looked random to civilian eyes but was actually a textbook security perimeter. "Sir, I'm Agent Martinez, FBI. We received a report of suspicious federal activity at this address. I'll need to verify some information with you." Karen practically bounced on her toes with vindicated excitement. "Yes! Finally! I told you he was running some kind of illegal operation. Search the house! Check his basement! I've seen government vehicles here at all hours." But something strange was happening. Agent Martinez wasn't handcuffing David or reading him his rights. Instead, she was speaking to him in the respectful tone reserved for someone whose authority you don't question. "Sir, for the record, could you please state your full name and current position?" David glanced at Sarah, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. 20 years of marriage to someone in federal law enforcement had taught her to read situations like this. "David Marcus Johnson. I work for the federal government." "Government position requires clarification, sir." "What department?" Karen interrupted with growing impatience. "What does it matter what fake job he claims to have? I'm telling you he's a criminal. My husband is City Councilman Richard Henderson. Call him right now and he'll confirm that I have the authority to make these accusations." Agent Martinez turned to Karen with the kind of professional politeness that somehow managed to be more intimidating than anger. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and allow us to complete our verification procedures. This is a federal matter now." "Federal matter? Of course it's federal. That's why I called you instead of those useless local police. I want him arrested immediately." But David was reaching into his wallet. and what he pulled out made Agent Martinez's entire demeanor shift in a way that even Karen couldn't miss. The agent looked at the credentials, then looked at David's face, then back at the credentials. Her expression moved through confusion, recognition, and finally something that looked very much like panic. "Sir, I need to verify this with my supervisor. Could you please wait here while I make a call?" David's slight smile was the first crack in his careful composure. "Of course, Agent Martinez. Take your time." As Martinez stepped away to speak urgently into her radio, Karen sensed that something wasn't going according to plan. "What's taking so long? Why aren't you arresting him? I'm telling you, I have evidence of criminal activity." Officer Rodriguez from the local police department had just arrived, responding to reports of a federal incident in his patrol area. He approached the scene with the careful neutrality of someone who knew that FBI involvement meant the situation was already above his pay grade. "Agent Martinez, I'm Officer Rodriguez, 14th District. Dispatch said you might need local support." Karen immediately latched onto this new authority figure. "Officer Rodriguez! Thank God. I'm Karen Henderson. My husband is City Councilman Richard Henderson. This man," she pointed at David again, "is a federal criminal, and the FBI is moving too slowly to arrest him." Rodriguez looked around the scene. Peaceful barbecue, federal agents in defensive positions, one agitated woman making accusations, and his police instincts told him that something was very wrong with this picture. "Ma'am, if the FBI is handling this, then it's out of my jurisdiction, but I can take your statement if—" "My statement? I've already given my statement. I want action. I want arrests. Do you people have any idea how many laws are being broken here?" Agent Martinez finished her radio conversation and returned with an expression that Karen completely misread as good news for her cause. "Sir, I've confirmed your identity with headquarters. Deputy Director Johnson, we had no idea you were located in this district." The words hit Karen like a physical blow. "Deputy Director? Deputy Director of what?" David's calm finally cracked, revealing something that made smart people choose their words very carefully. "FBI, Mrs. Henderson. I'm Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Counterintelligence Division." The color drained from Karen's face so quickly that Mrs. Lane actually stepped forward, worried she might collapse. Officer Rodriguez felt his stomach drop as he realized he was standing in the middle of what was about to become a federal incident involving threats against a senior government official. That's not possible," Karen whispered. "You people don't— federal officials don't live in neighborhoods like this." Agent Martinez was already pulling out incident report forms, her training kicking in as she realized the full scope of what had just happened. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to document your accusations against Deputy Director Johnson. For the record, you've alleged criminal activity against a senior federal official. That's a serious matter." Sarah Johnson, who had been watching this unfold with the professional interest of a federal prosecutor, finally spoke up. "Karen, I think you should probably call your husband, right now." But it was too late for phone calls. Karen Henderson had just accused the FBI's deputy director of being a criminal, demanded his arrest, and done it all while being recorded by federal agents following protocol for threats against government officials. The system she thought would protect her was about to become the system that held her accountable, and she was just beginning to understand how completely she had misjudged everything about power, authority, and who really belonged in her neighborhood. The moment hung suspended like a soap bubble about to burst. Karen Henderson stared at David Johnson with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just been turned upside down and shaken until all the pieces fell out. "There's been some mistake," she said, her voice hollow. "Federal officials don't live in regular neighborhoods. They don't have barbecues. They don't—" She gestured helplessly at the peaceful gathering, the children playing, the normal suburban scene that had somehow produced the most powerful law enforcement official she'd ever encountered. David excused himself politely. "Agent Martinez, if you'll give me just a moment, I think we can clear this up quickly." As he walked toward his house, Sarah followed him with her eyes, knowing exactly what he was about to do. 20 years of marriage to someone at David's level meant she understood the weight of symbols, the power of uniforms, and the devastating impact of revealing authority that people assumed didn't exist. Karen watched him go, her mind racing through every interaction they'd had over the past 6 months. The way other government employees deferred to him at block parties, the late-night phone calls that made him speak in clipped, authoritative tones, the security system that was obviously military-grade, the vehicles with government plates that she'd assumed were evidence of criminal activity. "This has to be some kind of elaborate cover story," she said to Agent Martinez, desperation creeping into her voice. "Criminal organizations fake government credentials all the time. You need to verify this independently. Call the real FBI and confirm that David Johnson is actually—" "Ma'am," Agent Martinez interrupted gently. "I just did call the real FBI. I spoke directly with the director's office. Deputy Director Johnson is exactly who he says he is." The front door of the Johnson house opened, and David emerged in full federal regalia. The transformation was stunning and complete. Gone was the suburban dad in a polo shirt and khakis. In his place stood a federal law enforcement official whose presence commanded immediate respect and attention. The navy blue FBI windbreaker bore his name and rank in official lettering. His shield hung from a lanyard that caught the afternoon light. Most devastating of all were the commendation bars on his chest. 20 years of federal service, congressional recognitions, and decorations that spoke of classified operations and national security achievements that Karen Henderson could never have imagined. The effect on the gathered crowd was electric. Agent Martinez and her team immediately straightened to attention. Officer Rodriguez, who had been skeptical of the entire situation, now looked like he wanted to disappear into the nearest pothole. Even the neighbors who had been skeptical of Karen's behavior now understood the full scope of what they had just witnessed. But the most dramatic transformation was in Karen herself. The confident, politically connected woman who had been making demands and throwing around her husband's authority suddenly looked very small and very afraid. "Deputy Director Johnson," Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying the formality reserved for senior officials, "I apologize for any confusion, or we weren't aware of your residential location or security arrangements." David's response was measured, professional, and absolutely devastating in its implications. "Agent Martinez, Mrs. Henderson has made several serious accusations against a federal official. She's alleged criminal activity, demanded my arrest, and interfered with a federal employee's right to peaceful enjoyment of his property. I'll need you to document everything she's said for my report to Internal Affairs." The words hit Karen like a series of physical blows. Internal Affairs. Federal official. Report. Each phrase carried implications she was just beginning to understand. "I didn't know," she whispered. But even as she said it, she realized how hollow it sounded. "I mean, I never would have, if I had known you were really—" "What, Mrs. Henderson?" David's voice carried 20 years of interrogation experience. "If you had known I was really what? Someone who deserved to live in this neighborhood? Someone whose children had a right to play safely in their own backyard? Someone who earned the authority you've been falsely claiming through your husband's position?" Sarah stepped forward, her federal prosecutor instincts recognizing a teachable moment. "Karen, you didn't attack David because you thought he was a criminal. You attacked him because he's black, and you couldn't imagine that a black man could legitimately belong in your neighborhood, no matter what his actual position or authority." The truth of it settled over the gathering like a blanket of uncomfortable recognition. Mrs. Lane nodded sadly, thinking of all the times she'd watched Karen dismiss people based on skin color alone. The Rodriguez family exchanged knowing looks, remembering their own encounters with Karen's assumptions about who belonged where. Agent Martinez was filling out forms with the mechanical precision of someone following federal protocol for threats against government officials. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that making false accusations against federal personnel is a federal crime. Interfering with federal employees in the performance of their duties is also a federal offense. Given that Deputy Director Johnson's work involves national security matters, there may be additional charges related to harassment of key federal personnel. Karen's knees actually buckled. Officer Rodriguez caught her arm to steady her, his expression a mixture of professional duty and personal mortification at being associated with this situation. "Federal charges?" she managed to say. "But I was trying to protect the neighborhood. I thought, my husband always said." "Your husband," David said quietly, "has no authority over federal law enforcement. City council positions don't override federal jurisdiction. Political connections at the local level mean nothing when you're threatening federal officials." The devastating irony was complete. Karen Henderson, who had spent 6 months using her husband's political position to harass her neighbors, had just discovered that real authority looked nothing like what she had imagined. The man she had dismissed as unworthy of her neighborhood outranked every politician she knew. The federal credentials she had assumed were fake were more legitimate than any authority she had ever possessed. More importantly, the system she had thought would protect her prejudices was about to become the system that held her accountable for them. "Mrs. Henderson," Agent Martinez said, closing her report folder, "you're going to need to come with us for questioning. Making threats against federal officials requires a full investigation." As Karen was led toward the black SUVs, her neighbors watched in stunned silence. The woman who had terrorized them with false authority was being held accountable by real authority. The man she had tried to drive from the neighborhood was revealing himself to be exactly the kind of person any community would be honored to have. David Johnson, FBI Deputy Director, looked around at his barbecue guests and neighbors, then made a decision that would change everything. "Agent Martinez, I think Mrs. Henderson and this community might benefit more from education than prosecution, but that's going to depend entirely on what happens next." The choice was about to be offered, but the consequences were already set in motion. Karen Henderson had learned the most expensive lesson of her life. Real power doesn't announce itself, and assumptions about who belongs where can destroy everything you think you know about the world. The next 48 hours transformed Karen Henderson's world from comfortable prejudice into federal accountability. What she had assumed would be a simple complaint to get rid of unwanted neighbors had triggered a full FBI investigation into threats against federal personnel, and the machinery of federal justice moved with terrifying efficiency. Monday morning, 9 a.m. Sharp, Agent Martinez returned to Maple Street with a full investigative team. This time, they weren't responding to a complaint. They were conducting a federal investigation, and Karen Henderson was about to learn the difference. David had spent Sunday evening in his home office, not as a neighbor defending his barbecue, but as FBI Deputy Director Johnson conducting a preliminary threat assessment. His report to FBI Internal Affairs was thorough, professional, and devastating in its implications. "Agent Martinez," he said, greeting the team from his front porch, still in his federal windbreaker from the previous day, "I've completed my initial threat assessment. Mrs. Henderson's behavior fits the profile of systematic harassment targeting federal personnel based on racial bias. We'll need a full pattern analysis." The investigation that followed was a masterclass in federal thoroughness. Karen watched from her window as FBI technicians photographed her house, documented her sight lines to the Johnson property, and analyzed her capacity for surveillance and harassment. Every phone call she'd made to city offices was subpoenaed. Every complaint she'd filed was cross-referenced. Every photograph she'd taken of David's house was examined for evidence of systematic stalking. The pattern that emerged was both broader and more damaging than anyone had realized. FBI database searches revealed that Karen's harassment wasn't limited to the Johnsons. Over 18 months, she had filed 47 complaints with various government agencies, and 39 of them targeted families of color. Her complaint pattern showed clear racial bias. Noise violations only called in on non-white families. Parking complaints only filed against cars belonging to minorities. Zoning violations only reported when people of color made home improvements. Agent Martinez presented the findings to David in his home office, the same room where Karen had imagined illegal activities taking place. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that she was now the subject of a legitimate federal investigation in the space she had tried to have raided. Deputy Director, we've identified 17 families who were directly impacted by Mrs. Henderson's harassment campaign. 3 families moved away specifically because of her complaints. 2 families filed restraining orders that were denied due to her husband's political influence. The economic impact on the neighborhood is measurable. Property values actually declined because word spread that the area was unwelcoming to diversity. David reviewed the files with the methodical precision that had made him one of the FBI's most effective investigators. Each case showed escalating harassment. Each complaint was strategically designed to make families feel unwelcome, and each action was protected by her husband's political connections. The Lopez family, Agent Martinez continued, received anonymous threatening letters after they moved away. Handwriting analysis matches samples from Mrs. Henderson's complaint letters. The Patel family had their car vandalized 3 times. Security footage shows someone matching Mrs. Henderson's description in the area during each incident. The Washington family's teenage son was followed home from school and confronted by someone claiming to be neighborhood security. Witnesses identified Mrs. Henderson. This wasn't just suburban racism. It was systematic intimidation that had crossed into federal territory the moment it targeted a federal official. Tuesday morning brought the confrontation that would define everything that followed. David, in full federal authority, accompanied by Agent Martinez and a federal prosecutor, arrived at Karen's door at exactly 8:00 a.m. Richard Henderson, the city councilman, answered the door with the expression of a man whose political career was about to end. He had spent Monday evening consulting lawyers and had been informed that his wife's actions had exposed him to federal corruption charges for using his position to protect her harassment campaign. "Deputy Director Johnson," he said quietly, "my wife. We need to discuss how to resolve this situation." Karen appeared behind her husband, and the transformation from confident neighborhood enforcer to frightened defendant was complete. Gone was the woman who had demanded arrests and threatened federal investigations. In her place stood someone who was beginning to understand the full scope of federal authority. "Mrs. Henderson," David said, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of federal law enforcement, "you've been systematically harassing federal personnel and interfering with my family's civil rights. You've also been targeting other families based on racial bias, which violates federal hate crime statutes." The federal prosecutor, a colleague of Sarah's from the U.S. Attorney's Office, laid out the charges Karen was facing with clinical precision. Intimidation of federal officials, up to 10 years federal prison. Civil rights violations under federal hate crime statutes, up to life imprisonment if we can prove conspiracy. Using city government resources for racial harassment, federal corruption charges, filing false federal crime reports, up to 5 years per incident. Karen's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't know. I never intended. My husband has always said we have rights as long-time residents." "Your husband," the federal prosecutor continued, "is facing his own charges. Using his position to deny restraining orders based on racial bias is a federal civil rights violation. Conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights is a serious federal crime." The full weight of federal justice was bearing down on both Hendersons, and their local political connections meant absolutely nothing. But David had made a decision that reflected both his federal authority and his commitment to actual justice rather than mere punishment. "Mrs. Henderson, the federal government has an interest in education as well as prosecution. You've committed serious federal crimes, but you've also exposed a system failure that goes beyond individual prejudice." He pulled out a folder that contained an alternative to federal prosecution, a restorative justice program designed specifically for biased crimes that could serve as a national model. Option 1. Federal prosecution. You'll likely serve 8 to 12 years in federal prison. Your husband will be removed from office and probably serve 5 to 7 years. Your family will be financially destroyed by legal fees and federal fines. Karen was crying now, finally understanding that her assumptions about political protection had been completely wrong. Option 2. You become the first participant in a new federal bias intervention program. 5 years of federal probation. 500 hours of community service specifically working with immigrant and minority families. Mandatory psychological counseling for racial bias. Complete financial restitution to the families you harassed. And most importantly, you become a public advocate for the federal civil rights protections you tried to violate. The choice was stark, but it was also an opportunity for genuine accountability rather than just punishment. If you choose option 2, Mrs. Henderson, you'll be monitored by federal agents for 5 years. Any violation of the agreement, any return to patterns of racial harassment, any attempt to use your husband's position to target minority families, and you'll immediately face the full federal charges. Agent Martinez added the final element that would make this case a national model. Mrs. Henderson, part of the program requires you to speak publicly about your actions and their consequences. Your case will be used to train federal agents on recognizing and responding to systematic racial harassment. Karen looked at her husband, whose political career was already over, then at the federal officials whose authority dwarfed anything she had ever imagined, then at the choice between genuine accountability and federal prison. I choose the program, she whispered. I want to fix what I've broken. David nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had turned a moment of personal attack into an opportunity for systemic change. Mrs. Henderson, this program isn't just about you. It's about creating a model for how federal authorities can protect civil rights at the community level. The investigation that had started with a racist attack on a backyard barbecue was about to become a blueprint for federal civil rights enforcement nationwide. Karen Henderson's prejudice had accidentally triggered the creation of a program that would protect thousands of families from exactly the kind of harassment she had inflicted. Justice, it turned out, sometimes worked in ways that surprised everyone, including the people who thought they understood how power really worked in America. 6 months later, the transformation of both Karen Henderson and Maple Street had become a case study in federal civil rights enforcement that would reshape how America addresses systematic racial harassment. The federal courtroom in downtown Chicago was packed with community leaders, civil rights advocates, and federal officials as Judge Patricia Williams prepared to formally approve the plea agreement that would make Karen Henderson the first participant in the Federal Bias Intervention and Community Restoration Program. Karen stood before the bench, her appearance as transformed as her understanding of justice. Gone was the entitled, politically connected woman who had terrorized her neighbors. In her place stood someone who had spent 180 days working directly with immigrant families at the South Side Community Center, learning firsthand the human cost of the prejudice she had spent years inflicting. Mrs. Henderson, Judge Williams said, you've completed the preliminary phase of your federal probation. Tell the court what you've learned. Karen's voice was steady but carried the weight of genuine remorse. Your Honor, I spent years believing that my husband's political position gave me the right to decide who belonged in our neighborhood. I used that false authority to terrorize families whose only crime was being different from me. I caused children to cry, families to move away, and turned a community into a place of fear instead of welcome. She turned toward the gallery where David and Sarah Johnson sat with Maya and Zoe, now 9 years old, and thriving in their school's diversity leadership program. Deputy Director Johnson, I attacked you and your family because I couldn't imagine that a black man could legitimately have more authority than I claimed to possess. My racism was so deep that I called the FBI on the FBI's Deputy Director. I'm standing here today not because you chose revenge, but because you chose justice that could educate rather than just punish. Judge Williams reviewed the documentation that had made Karen's case a federal model. Mrs. Henderson, Your actions resulted in 3 families leaving the neighborhood, caused economic damage totaling $1.2 million in decreased property values, and created a pattern of civil rights violations that required federal intervention. How do you propose to repair this damage? Karen had prepared for this moment through months of working with federal victim advocates and community restoration specialists. Your Honor, I've already begun full financial restitution to the affected families. I've established a $500,000 community fund for bias incident prevention programs. I've completed 320 hours of community service working with the families I harmed, and I've testified before Congress about how local political corruption can enable systematic racial harassment. The congressional testimony had been particularly powerful. Karen had become an unlikely advocate for federal civil rights enforcement, explaining to lawmakers how political connections had protected her harassment campaign until she encountered someone with real federal authority. Agent Martinez, now promoted to oversee the national expansion of the Bias Intervention Program, presented the broader impact to the court. Your Honor, Mrs. Henderson's case has become the foundation for federal bias intervention programs in 47 states. Her public testimony has led to the identification and prosecution of 17 similar harassment networks nationwide. The Federal Bias Intervention Program has already prevented an estimated 340 families from experiencing the kind of systematic harassment the Johnson family endured. David Johnson addressed the court in his capacity as FBI Deputy Director, but his words carried personal weight as well. Your Honor, Mrs. Henderson's transformation demonstrates that accountability can be more powerful than punishment when it includes genuine education and community restoration. Her case has enabled the FBI to develop protocols that protect federal personnel and all citizens from bias-based harassment. The formal judgment was swift and comprehensive. Karen Henderson, 5 years federal probation, 500 hours community service completed, $750,000 in total restitution paid, and permanent prohibition from any form of government advocacy or complaint filing. Richard Henderson, resignation from City Council, 2 years federal probation, and permanent disbarment from holding public office. But the real victory was measured in changed lives and protected communities. The Maple Street neighborhood had transformed from a place where prejudice was protected by political connections into a model community for federal civil rights enforcement. Mrs. Lane, now 87, had become the neighborhood's official welcome coordinator for new families. The Patel family had returned from considering relocation to become community leaders. 3 new families of color had moved to Maple Street specifically because word had spread that it was a place where diversity was federally protected. Most importantly, Maya and Zoe Johnson were growing up in a community where their father's authority was respected, their family's belonging was unquestioned, and their futures were secured not just by wealth and opportunity, but by federal laws that made their civil rights real and enforceable. The case that began with racist hatred at a backyard barbecue had become a national model for turning prejudice into protection, transforming individual accountability into systematic justice, and proving that when federal authority is properly applied, real change becomes possible. 1 year after Karen Henderson's racist attack transformed into federal accountability, Maple Street had become something unprecedented, a neighborhood where civil rights weren't just protected by law, but actively celebrated by the community. The 4th annual Johnson Family Barbecue drew visitors from across Chicago. Federal officials, civil rights advocates, and families who had been helped by the Federal Bias Intervention Program gathered to celebrate what had become known as the barbecue that changed America. Karen Henderson was there too, but not as the neighborhood enforcer she had once been. After completing her federal community service, she had become an advocate for bias intervention programs, sharing her story of transformation to help implement the protocols her own case had created. "I spent years believing political connections gave me the right to terrorize my neighbors," she told visiting community leaders. "It took facing federal prosecution to understand that real authority comes from protecting people's rights, not violating them." David Johnson, still FBI Deputy Director, but now also a national expert on community-based civil rights enforcement, watched with quiet satisfaction. Maya and Zoe, now 10 years old, were teaching other children how to fold dumplings using techniques Mrs. Lane had passed down. The statistics spoke to broader change. In the year since the federal bias intervention program launched, bias incidents in participating communities had dropped by 67%. Property values in diverse neighborhoods had increased by 23%, as federal protections made them safe for all families. Over 2,800 families had avoided harassment because potential perpetrators knew that systematic bias now triggered federal investigation. Sarah Johnson, recently promoted to Chief Federal Prosecutor for Civil Rights Enforcement, had used Karen's case to establish legal precedents protecting any family targeted by systematic racial harassment. The ripple effects had reached the highest levels of government. Congress had allocated $500 million for bias intervention programs based on the Maple Street model. The FBI had created a new division specifically focused on community-level civil rights protection. But perhaps the most powerful change was simpler and more human. Children like Maya and Zoe were growing up in communities where diversity wasn't just tolerated, but federally protected, where assumptions about who belonged where had been replaced by laws that made belonging a right rather than a privilege. Mrs. Lane, now 88 and the neighborhood's official historian, put it best. We learned that real power isn't about making people leave. It's about making sure everyone can stay. As the sun set over Maple Street, families packed up their dishes and gathered their children, secure in the knowledge that their community was protected not just by good intentions, but by federal law and real accountability. The barbecue that started with hatred had become a celebration of justice, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with someone brave enough to reveal who they really are. Have you witnessed systematic bias in your community? Share your story in the comments below. If this video showed you how federal accountability can create real change, hit like and subscribe to Black Voices Speak for more stories of justice in action. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how real authority protects rather than threatens the communities it serves. Because when we hold prejudice accountable at the federal level, we don't just change individual lives, we change the entire system. Hit that notification bell so you never miss stories of justice prevailing when good people stand up to hatred with real authority.